has really devoted in the last, I would say 10 to 15 years in this process of spreading education. So he's done everything from writing textbooks to one thing I really appreciate about Keanu is his availability. He spent many hours in communities giving lectures at different universities. I saw him, I've been to lectures that he's given from places like the Iolani Palace to Kamehameha schools to a lot of places. We've used his book in some of my classes, and he's done a really great job in trying to present his research to not only to people in Hawaii but around the world. And I think we've seen the impact of that. If you ever hear people referring to Hawaii and use the word occupation, that is a product of his work. And increasingly you're seeing people start to understand and also talk about Hawaii in ways that have been influenced by his research. So we're grateful to have him in class today. Before we turn the time over to Dr. Sai, I ask Iho to open us with the pule.
Kia kua maulama kalani, e mākou mamo me ka mahalo nui no na pamaka ia pau. Mahalo no Dr. Keanu Sai, kia mā kamaka I kia umi. E kia kua, e haawi mai ia mākou I ka uhana he malele kia manawa, hiki ke mapupu I no I pili ana I kia mā mea pau. Mahalo no kia kuna nui ia. Hapa mai ka ia mākou me ka mapupu ana. Na hualalo o Dr. Sai and nui ko mako aloha ia oi. Makaina o kako Yesu Christo. Amene.
Alright, thank you, mahalo. We brought some small makana for you. So and so the way that we design this is, and we've been talking that our students have already heard your lecture, and we've gone through your book, especially in the previous semester with this is a two-part series class. We read the work. So I've asked each of them to come today with questions. So it's designed to be a discussion, and but however we want the flow of the conversation to go. Most of the lecture that we saw was about the executive agreements, and as you know, he begins that by talking about the relationship between Hawaii and international countries that it formed treaties with. And then, of course, it goes into the executive agreement between President Cleveland and the Queen. So, I'm going to turn the time over to you. And again, let's warmly welcome Dr. Keanu Sai.
How much time do you have?
Class goes till 10:45, so a little over an hour.
Okay, good. Aloha?
Aloha.
So, how'd you guys like the video? Was it informative? Okay, good. That's the main thing. I try to present it in such a way that I would understand it. So, pictures, jokes. You guys may have noticed that. So, I'm a Kamehameha grad, 1982. After Kamehameha schools, I went to a military college, New Mexico military. That's where I got my commission as a second lieutenant. And my associate's degree, transferred to UH, got my bachelor's, and then I went off and played Army, retired as a captain. I was on both active and reserve, I was field artillery. And then got the master's, the PhD, and here I am today. Okay. I'm not an activist, far from it. I'm the most conservative guy you're gonna meet. A very rule-based, very military in mind, right? Operate on information, not assumptions, and develop a battle plan, but before you come up with a battle plan, you gotta have the intel. Now, one particular concept that I take to heart, which is very Hawaiian, is that the practical value of history is that it's a film of the past run through the projector of today onto the screen of tomorrow. That film never changes, but your projector has to get updated. Once you update the projector, now you see something. Now, that concept right there is a Hawaiian way of looking at the future, because the Hawaiian term for future is kava mahope. Va or manava. Va is short for manava. Kava mahope, mahope is backwards, it's a directional. So literally, kava mahope for future is the time of the past. Okay? So when you tell a Hawaiian look to the future, they turn to the past. In that past is the mo'olelo, the stories. In these stories, you capitalize on successes, you learn from mistakes. Once you get that, you will naturally get what is called ike. Now you have foresight. Now you see something you didn't see before. And once you see something you didn't see before, then you have to start to think about, well, what is my kuleana, what is my responsibility within this framework of what I now see that I cannot deny. And that's my approach. So if you notice, I don't talk about the future, I talk about the past. But as I talk about the past, you can clearly see the future, right? And I'm not even saying what's going to happen. You can kind of predict what's happening. Now, from an academic standpoint, it's called theory. You gotta have the appropriate theoretical framework, because theory by definition is an explanation of phenomenon without which you wouldn't be able to understand it, right? That's all a theory is. And once you apply the appropriate theory, you can actually predict what's going to happen, right? And that's what happens when you start to learn about Hawaii's history. And the theoretical framework that is applied, I don't apply it through the native culture. You know? I'm not a proponent of Hawaiian culture. I just live it. I leave it up to the cultural practitioners to do that. What I am is looking at something that not only can make sense out of it, but is this theoretical framework internationally understood as well? That way I'm not trying to convince people of a particular way of a view, but rather speak to the view that everybody knows. I just fill in the gaps with Hawaii's facts. And then people go, whoa, say, glad I got your attention. So with that, any questions?
I'm gonna ask Lokahi to ask our first question. Sorry.
Hey, your mom is, who's your mom?
Jen.
That's right, my classmate. I just saw Jennifer not too long ago. We used to play football with my son, Kapua.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Kiha.
Kiha.
Yeah, okay. Komemel. Small world. You look like your dad. So, I guess.
Oh, I was wondering, because you said Hawaii had a lot of treaties with other countries.
Okay.
And then I was wondering if any of those treaties stipulated like intervening between the conflict between the U.S. and Hawaii at the time. Because I know there's like, would any of those other countries be willing to intervene with the U.S. and Hawaii?
Okay, so that question will lead into me explaining what is international relations. Okay, and then we can go back and revisit that question. Okay, so when we speak about states, right? We speak about a state. What is a state? Anybody? What do you think a state is? What do you think?
Independently identified group with a self-acting government.
Almost there.
Recognized internationally.
So a state is a country, right? Defined border, right? Centralized government, people in it. Now, the difference though is whether or not that state is independent. And that's an IR question, okay? So when you apply the term independent state, right? That brings on another take on what is a state. So the term independence is not being physically independent of something, right? Independence is a political term. It means that your laws exist over your territory independent of other laws over other territories. So independence and sovereignty are synonymous. Supreme authority over territory, okay? Now, you can be a state and not be independent. And I'll give you an example. Japan in the 1800s, they say 1880. Japan had what is called unequal treaties with European powers, including the United States, including Hawaii, which means when a national of that particular country gets into trouble in Japan, they could only be prosecuted by the laws of their nation, not Japanese law. Okay? Now that's an indication that that country is not recognizing Japan's independence, because if Japan was an independent state, then its laws applies to everyone, whether nationals or aliens resident within its territory. It's called territorial jurisdiction. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to give you an example oh, and by the way, going back to Japan, the Hawaiian Kingdom, its treaty with Japan in 1871 actually allowed imposition of a Hawaiian Kingdom law in Japanese territory. So if a Hawaiian subject, which is a Hawaiian national, gets into trouble in Japan, he could only be prosecuted under Hawaiian Kingdom law. And the court to administer justice would be the consulate, and they call that consular jurisdiction. Okay, so other non-European powers imposed, no, they were the receiving end of that imposition of other countries' laws, right? Hawaii was actually one of them. Along with Japan was China, Siam, which is Thailand, Japan, Ottoman Turks, Persia. So they were states, but they weren't independent. But they became independent the latter part of the 19th century. Make sense? Let me use a more contemporary example of independence with regard to a state. New York. Did you folks know that New York used to be an independent state? Anybody? Yeah. So, okay, 1783, King George III signs the surrender, rendering the revolution successful. And he recognized in that Treaty of Paris 13 former colonies as now 13 independent states in a confederation. Now, a confederation is not a federation. A confederation is a loose union of independent states, sort of like the European Union we have today, okay? And then in 1789, 6 years later, these 13 independent states gave up their independence into a federation, thus creating the United States of America that we know of today. Now, New York went from an independent state, which means from 1783 to 1789, only New York law applied over that territory, right? Not Georgia law, right? Not Virginia law, so forth. Massachusetts law, Pennsylvania law. They were all independent of each other. But once they formed the federation, now you have a duality of laws now in those territories. You have not only the New York law, but what other law would you have after 1789? Congressional law, laws passed in Congress, right? So that's an example of a state that was independent, transferred its independence, but still remained a state. Make sense? Okay, so now going back to your question about Hawaii. In 1843, November 28th, Hawaii was recognized as an independent state, the Anglo-French Proclamation, okay? Great Britain was the primary party to recognize Hawaiian independence, not France. France merely acknowledged it, okay? Because Hawaii was actually part of the British Empire since 1794. You notice that Union Jack in the flag? That's from Kamehameha I. That's not from the state of Hawaii. That flag actually is the Hawaiian Kingdom flag. Okay? So Hawaii used to be a British colony, a British protectorate, not a colony. Okay? And Kamehameha was still the king of Hawaii, right? But he recognized King George III as his liege and lord. A feudal system, which in international terms we call an empire, right? Where you have a king at the top and kingdoms within it. Sort of like a Republican federation, right? You have a president at the top and you have governors below it. Same concept. So Hawaii in 1843 recognized as an independent state, which means anybody in Hawaii, whether British or French, would be subjected to Hawaiian Kingdom law if they get into trouble. They cannot claim protection under British law, as they could in Japan, in the 1880s. Okay. Now, once Hawaii was recognized as an independent state by Great Britain, it entered into diplomatic relations with other countries, which means Hawaii's independence was not dependent upon the rest of the world. It was strictly dependent on Great Britain, just like the United States independence was not didn't rely on the whole world to recognize the United States as an independent state. It relied on who to recognize the United States as an independent state in a confederation? The British, because they used to be a British colony. But Hawaii wasn't a colony, it was a British protectorate. So the issue was Great Britain is the source of Hawaii's secession, seceding to become an independent state. So Hawaii, by 1893, was a member of what is called the Family of Nations. There were only 44 independent states in 1893, 44. Hawaii was one of them, okay? These countries would enter into treaties, but you didn't have to enter into a treaty with an independent state to be in the Family of Nations. The Family of Nations is not an organization. A Family of Nations is like it's like a pedigree. It's like Rottweilers. Okay, it's the pedigree of, let's say, pit bulls. Okay, you have different types of pit bulls, gray pit bulls, razor's edge. I got a razor's edge, but these are the types of pit bulls that are in this family. That's what an independent state is. Now, within the family, okay, so you have the family of independent states, a loose term. Independent states within it, these are 44. Some of them, not all of them, may enter into an organization of a membership where there are stipulations and obligations. And one of the particular memberships that Hawaii became as an international organization on January 1st, 1882 was the Universal Postal Union. Universal Postal Union was formed in 1874 to regulate parcels and letters, deliveries, and all that stuff. Okay. Today it exists as a specialized agency of the United Nations. Okay. It still exists today. Now, countries who are not in the Universal Postal Union were not bound by those agreements, because if you're an independent state, international law is based upon the law between states, the law between nations. And the law between nations is evidenced by agreements, which could be treaties, which could be international organizations. So you always have to have an agreement, right? Which is the basis of international relations, an agreement between independent states. Other states may enter into agreements for commercial purposes, but it doesn't mean they entered into it with other countries, right? Now, what's also played into this is in the Family of Nations, back then, for economic purposes, you actually have what is called the Most Favored Nation clause. Most Favored Nation clause provides equality. If one country gives something to another country, they cannot discriminate and not give it to another. That's the term Most Favored Nation used in the 19th century. So when Hawaii enters into a treaty with certain stipulations that may benefit one particular country, another country may claim an equal right. An example of that would be in 1887, the supplemental agreement to the Treaty of Reciprocity between Hawaii and the United States was a commercial treaty. Hawaii gave exclusive access to America, its ships, refueling and coaling in Pearl Harbor, right? Great Britain was claiming, even though they didn't have a treaty for that, they said, hey, that's a violation of the Most Favored Nation clause if you don't allow us in as well. So that's an example of Most Favored Nation, where it doesn't even apply where you actually have a treaty, but it applies if you're a member of the Family of Nations. Am I making sense? Am I going too fast here? You guys good? I'm watching your eyes now. When I see you going, okay, I gotta slow down. It's very complex, it's complicated. I'm trying to simplify it as much as I can. So now going back to the question of a treaty, okay. A treaty can only be terminated by the parties who entered into that treaty. A treaty cannot be terminated by a third party, right? And customary rule of terminating a treaty is one party must notify the other of its intention to terminate, and then once the other party receives it, 12 months kicks in, treaty terminated. Okay, that's how you're supposed to do it. And that provision is actually in the treaties themselves on termination. But not all treaties have that termination clause. Like the Hawaiian-British Treaty does not have a termination clause, as opposed to the Hawaiian-American Treaty. It has that 12-month window, right? But that doesn't say the Hawaiian Kingdom cannot terminate its treaty with Great Britain because there's no clause, No, there's a customary practice, give notice 12 months, treaty ends. So, other countries cannot get involved as a third party with treaties between other countries. And for Hawaii, those treaties still exist because there has been no notification from the Hawaiian Kingdom to terminate. Thus, the other side, evidence of receiving the termination, notice of termination, thus initiating the 12-month clock. Because what was overthrown in 1893 was what? What was overthrown in 1893, January 17th? Remember the video? The what? The government. Okay, why is that significant? The government.
It's just the people who delegate the law, not the law itself.
Okay, go ahead.
It's just the governing body, not the state itself.
Exactly. By the mid-19th century, okay, it's been customary practice to separate the state and the government. It's customary practice because in the mid-19th century, 1870s, Brussels Conference, they were codifying laws of war, okay? Now, under international law, war is legal, right? That's the ultimate form of dispute resolution between states, okay? It wasn't until the 1920s, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, that they said, not war is illegal, but aggressive wars are illegal. War is still legal. That's why you still have wars today regulated by international law, namely the Hague and Geneva Conventions. But in the mid-19th century, they began to codify what is called customary international law. So customary international law are laws that are accepted by all countries. Let's say all 44 countries. It is custom. There is no question. This is what the law is. Now, when you create a treaty, like in 1899, the Hague Convention, which regulates war, right? Hague Convention number 4, the laws of war and occupation. That is recognized as a codification of an already existing custom, meaning it's not new law. It's just codification. So as they're codifying, they have to ensure that they distinguish between the government and the state. Because in war, a government can be overthrown. Right? I mean, that's the objective of the military. Take that government down and subdue it, right? So if you overthrow the government, international law mandates the occupier to establish a military government to serve as a temporary or serve as a proxy to administer the laws of the occupied state. So that's why this separation of government and state was crucial in laws of war, right? And the laws of war also activates what is called neutrality. Other countries that are not at war have to stand back. So Hawaii was recognized as a neutral state by the Swedish-Norwegian Treaty, which is 1852, the German Treaty, and what's the other one? German, Sweden, Norwegian. There's the third one, I forgot. But that provision of neutrality means once war breaks out between countries, Hawaiian neutrality kicks in. It's like a pu'uonua, yeah. And Hawaii was actually one of 4 recognized neutral territories by treaty. Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Hawaiian Kingdom. Yeah. So these ideas of the laws of war is what separated government from state. Because if you don't do that, then the laws of war, it's not comprehensive anymore, right? And then ultimately that military government is replaced by the lawful government of that state. And that's when we call occupation comes to an end. So these ideas of an overthrow of a government is important to know and to distinguish between the government and the state. A lot of people talk about 1893, the overthrow. They assume the whole thing was overthrown. It was the government that was overthrown, not the country. Just like in 2003, Iraq's government was overthrown. That didn't mean Iraq ceased to exist as a state. 1945, Japan's government was overthrown. Japan still existed. The same thing applied to Hawaii. That answer that question. That was a roundabout way to provide some context.
But the second part of his question was, why didn't anybody step in to help if we already had these agreements? Was there no country willing to go to bat for the Hawaiian Kingdom when the U.S. military was occupying it?
So, okay, so here's the thing about what happened in 1893. It's very complicated. First of all, number one rule of international relations is you do not intervene in the internal affairs of another state because it violates the independence of that state, okay? You don't intervene, right? Now, in this case, the United States ambassador intervened, John Stevens. He had planned to take over take over the government with the plan for them to travel to Washington to sign a treaty annexing all of Hawaii because of Pearl Harbor. Because of Hawaii thought of as a military outpost to protect the west coast of the United States. So that was what was in John Stevens' mind. Okay, and it's evidenced in an article he wrote in December of 1893. I think it was the American Historical Review. Now, when John Stevens did this, he had to disguise the invasion, right? See, the plan was to have certain insurgents. You guys know what that word insurgent means, so President Cleveland used the word insurgents. He referred to Sanford Dole as an insurgent. James Blunt referred to them as insurgents, meaning people who commit the high crime of treason. That's the insurgency. To basically recognize these insurgents as if they were a successful revolution, right? Because an internal revolution, international law does not look at it as whether legal or illegal. It just looks at it whether or not it's successful or unsuccessful, right? So when George Washington and them fought against the British Crown, they were insurgents, right? And international law will only determine whether or not they're going to be successful or not. Because if they're not successful, then what happens to insurgents? Yeah, they get tried, convicted, and executed, right? When you win, then that doesn't happen. Then you move from an insurgent to a patriot, okay? So it took America 7 years to fight, to succeed in their revolution, which is internal. Here, John Stevens was trying to disguise it in Hawaii as if it was an internal revolt, okay? It was like the revolution lasted 30-something hours. It's kind of difficult because Hawaii's government was actually on different islands as well. You got governors on different islands. You have circuit courts on different islands. You know, this was a fully functioning country now. They were just in Honolulu. So right off the bat, there is no way that you could succeed in a revolution in 36 hours if you haven't even touched the other islands and the counties, you know, back then. Well, not counties, they called it later, but what we know today as counties. So he had this plan that he's going to have them be protected by U.S. Marines. So he ordered the landing of U.S. Marines on January 16th. They marched up Mililani Street and set up in a defensive posture right across from the government building where Kamehameha statue is. That's Ali Olanihale. Okay. And then what happened there was the next day, certain individuals went into the government building, which was on Monday, right? And they declared themselves to be new government, high treason. And then John Stevens recognized them as the lawful government, meaning they succeeded in the revolution, and then ordered the Marines to protect them from being arrested for treason, because Hawaii had about 500 police force of about 500, including the Queen's Guard. They were going to apprehend them. But the Queen was told, if you apprehend them, you're going to run into the Marines, and you're going to have a war. And that's when the Queen said, oh, everybody slow down here. This is where I'm very glad Wahine was in charge. Yeah. Because if it was a guy, come on, rah. You got more coming after you took these guys out. The Queen was thinking ahead, plus she's a head of state. And she knew that this had to do with the US ambassador running rogue in her eyes. This is not from the United States of America. This is not a policy of invasion, right? And that's when she yielded her authority, right? A surrender to the United States and called upon them to do an investigation. Now, this time frame, this is January 17th, 1893. The United States didn't know about the illegality or the alleged illegality until March 9th of 1893, when US President Grover Cleveland came into office. Benjamin Harrison didn't know. They kept this information from him, okay? Cleveland received information from the Queen's representative, Paul Newman, who was the former Attorney General of the kingdom. That is when he initiated the investigation by appointing James Blount on March 9th. James Blount arrived here March 31st, and he started his investigation on April 1st. So from January 17th, 1893 to April 1st, the whole world doesn't know really what's going on, and the United States doesn't really know what's going on, except for John Stevens and probably Captain Wilkes of the USS Boston. It wasn't until James Blount finished his investigation, final report July 17th, 1893, sent to the Secretary of State, where the fact-finding mission was complete, but it was still secret. Secretary of State Walter Gresham is still trying to figure out what do they have to do. On October 18, Walter Gresham, the Secretary of State, notifies the President, we're in the wrong. That's his conclusion. We have to reinstate the Queen, meaning the government, not the state, right? The country still exists. And then President Cleveland notifies Congress on December 18th what happened, and says by an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. Let me unpackage that right there, because that's big. In international relations, when a head of state uses the term act of war, that's an act of hostility, you've just transformed the state of affairs between Hawaii and the United States into a state of war. That's what you've done. In international relations, there are only two states of affairs, state of peace, state of war. He acknowledged that by an act of war, a government of an independent state has been overthrown, and accepted responsibility, and he says he's in negotiations with the Queen for reinstatement. But this is now all within the laws of war. Again, more so, why the separation of government from state kicks in during a state of war. Now, the whole world is not knowing what's going on until Cleveland gives his message. And that's October 18th. That's way after January. So you can see how things get very complicated. Today we take for granted TV, telephone. Imagine what's happening here, right? So other countries could not intervene without possibly becoming a participant in an act of war. And it gets very complicated, because actually 20 countries committed acts of war in 1894 when this provisional government changed its name to the Republic of Hawaii. Now they're still insurgents. They're not a government. And by other countries recognizing them as the new government, number one, duty of non-intervention, right? But second, during war, the only entity that deals with this situation is the United States through Cleveland, who acknowledge that they're responsible. The others, their action, by definition of international relations and law, they've actually become a participant in the state of war with Hawaii. It gets very complicated, right? Now, step aside from all of that. It doesn't matter whether or not countries assist, because they're all independent, right? The question is whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists as an independent state, with or without a government. We know for sure the government was overthrown illegally. The US president admitted it, tried to reinstate it through the executive agreements that you folks saw in the video, but it was never carried out. That means the question is whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists as a state, not whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom is still recognized. The question is it still a state? And that's where everything comes into play. That's the starting point in reassessing Hawaii's history. You start off with Hawaii as an independent state. And then you ask the question, where did it go? And the only way it can not be an independent state, it had to have merged into another independent state. You need a treaty. We don't have a treaty. But during the laws of war, state of war, one country cannot unilaterally annex another country. What you're supposed to do is administer the laws of the occupied country, right? But there's a catch-22 there. There's a term in international relations that we call debillatio. Debillatio is subjugation. Countries at war, but it has to be a just war, right? Dispute resolution. If they engage, did you know that one country could be subjugated by another and unilaterally subsumed? Napoleon was doing that in Europe. It was recognized as that. In fact, Europe in the 1820s, European countries were entertaining that idea of conquest by reconquering South America's independent states. They wanted to go back in and retake it, and they were going to claim it by debillatio, not a treaty of conquest. And that's what prompted the Monroe Doctrine. That was the policy of making sure that nobody's going to touch these newly formed independent states in the Americas, which included the United States. And that's the foundation of the Monroe Doctrine. It was to hold back reinvading South America and the Americas. So when you look at this situation in the family of nations, that Hawaii was an independent state, we need to understand how it operated at that time, right? And that's when you either have what is called a state of war or a state of peace. Occupations of independent states do not take place during a state of peace. Occupations can only take place during a state of war. Yeah. But for Hawaii, we have what is called an unjust war, because President Cleveland admitted it was all illegal. That means debillatio, the sense of subjugation, the rule of subjugation, and consuming another state wouldn't apply to Hawaii. So international law actually protects Hawaii, but what it protects is the Hawaiian state. It doesn't protect a government. The government is formed by the laws of the state. These are domestic laws. So every government is geopolitical, but every state is a subject of international law. So international law protects the state, not the government. So in 1893, we didn't need anybody to intervene to protect the statehood. But we could use intervention to assist in reforming the government under the Queen to re-engage with diplomatic relations. Because Hawaii had over 90 embassies and consulates around the world. So we could have had intervention, but at this time, America was a rising power, right? Wasn't there yet. In 1890, you had this guy, Captain Alfred Mahon from the US Naval War College. He was promoting changing the doctrine of America in building a large navy. And he wrote that book, you know, basically saying America should be like its European brethren. Large navy, but if you have a large navy, you need military outposts. All of a sudden, Vieques, Subic Bay, Philippines, but that's Spanish. Pearl Harbor, even Samoa, they're actually entertaining Samoa, Pongo Pongo, as a naval base, right? Especially with the Panama Canal about to be built, right? So a lot of this, if you read a lot of the work of Captain Alfred Mahon, they talk about this, and Mahon actually speaks directly about Hawaii. So Hawaii got caught in this power vacuum. That's basically what happened to it. But in light of all of that stuff, the state still exists. See, that's the key. Despite all the politics, despite all the problems, all the miscommunication, the state still exists. But you have to go back to what was Hawaii before the invasion. You don't start off with what was Hawaii after 1893. You have to look at what was Hawaii before 1893. And that's when that's the starting point. Yes?
Like all this stuff about Hawaii and how there's a lot of
there are a lot of things that happen illegally, obviously, and a lot of things happen unethically, and a lot of things. But
Now, there's a difference between unethical and illegal.
yeah, but I think both things happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, the U.S. has kind of shown time and time again that, or just countries of power in general. But I guess my question is, how can we be confident that the law is going to pertain to them? It seems like all these laws were broken, but it didn't matter because the country or the state of Hawaii was still occupied. Still, these terrible things happen. So like, I just don't understand how we can stop something like that from happening.
Well, before you get into a conclusion, let's assess a hypothesis, right? So remember, you're supposed to test the hypothesis. You're not supposed to prove it. So your hypothesis is your educated guess. This is what I think it is before you start your research. You don't say, this is what it is, I'm gonna prove it, okay? Because what you end up doing is, then you become selective in your evidence. It's called cherry picking. In psychology, it's called confirmation bias. And it becomes a part of communal reinforcement. So you get people who believe in the bias to reinforce the communal idea of thinking. So as academics, okay, and also as political scientists, you have to step back away from what you perceive and start to make sure that you ask the right questions. So the first question shouldn't be, well, how could this be fixed, right? Well, that's loaded with assumptions. The question would be, what was Hawaii before the United States came here? See, that would be something that needs to be understood first. And that's when you get into Hawaii as a former British protectorate since 1794. Then all of a sudden, 1843 pops up, November 28th, which is in the Hawaiian Kingdom, a national holiday called Independence Day, La Kuokoa. So my great-grandparents, my tutu's parents, were born in 1880. This was their country. Every November 28th, they celebrated Independence Day. For me, I know nothing about that. Nothing. I was blank on Hawaii's history, right? A lot of us were. But once we identify Hawaii as an independent state, then we have to look at, well, how did Hawaii operate with other independent states? See, then we start to get into what is international relations and law at that time, not what I perceive it to be today, because that could be infused with maybe bias, maybe watching Fox News, I'm joking, maybe watching CNN, maybe watching Auntie giving her lecture, as opposed to what actually it is, right? Remember, we have to judge yesterday by yesterday's standard, not today's standard, and walk it up today as that standard is changing but is consistent, right? So once we identify how these states operate, then we start to think, gee, now it makes sense why she said what she said. Now this makes sense of why Kauikeaoli, Kameme III, said what he said and got this done. See, what we're doing here is we're applying the appropriate theoretical framework that has the ability to explain, right? So another way of using this appropriate theoretical framework, it's like we've been trying to explain a football game in Hawaii by using baseball rules. Same facts, wrong rules. Once you apply football rules, you go, whoa, now things resonate that did not resonate before. See, that was like me watching rugby for the first time. I had no clue what they were doing because I came from American football. I was like, I couldn't get it. Until a friend of mine who's Maori explained it to me, the basic rules. I went, oh, got it. No forward passing. That's why you guys going like this on the side. I didn't know that. Then things start to make sense. What I'm talking about through education is understanding what happened, not promoting a particular view of how you should conclude this should take place. Everything is, let's reevaluate what happened. Yeah, so
I guess my question is the goal to change something or is it to inform?
the goal is to know. The goal is to understand.
So it's more just to understand what happened.
That's primary. Yeah.
And then moving forward, would the goal be to?
Okay, so if I'm gonna play a game against the All Blacks, right? And I know they're good. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna say I'm gonna play. First of all, I'm gonna learn the game rugby. Once I fully understand the game, then I may make a decision. I think I'll play against them. I don't start off, I'm gonna play, because I'm gonna get run over, right? I'm gonna have to first learn what is rugby. And I cannot come in trying to learn rugby with an attitude. Like I'm gonna say, I'm an American, I know football, I know American football, let me see what I can learn from rugby. No, you have to dispense with everything you think you know, remove all bias, and just say, can I learn how this game is played? Now, whether or not I wanna play the game after I understand the game, well, that's another question, right? There's some people that don't wanna play because it's too scary. They'd rather watch from the stands. Actually, I take it where I play. I actually take theory into practice. So when I travel, when I argue the case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, I'm actually playing the game. I'm actually part of a team. And you're actually seeing it work, right? But it's not running. It's crawl, walk, run. But when you think about it from the past, I'm thinking, man, they were playing this game. They were running, but they knew it. I don't know it. See, when you know you don't know is when you can learn. When you think you know, a little difficult learning, because it has to get through the information you previously held. And that's where it starts to get, there's a term called cognitive dissonance. I went through that. It's like, no way, no way. Because I was in the Army, remember? I'm like, wait a minute, am I in the right Army? No way, no way. It came to a point where I couldn't deny it. I'm like, it's like the movie The Matrix. I took the red pill, and now I see two worlds.
So you said that, or you mentioned that treaties can only be terminated by the two parties involved.
By mutual consent, right?
By mutual consent. And so all the treaties that were made between Hawaii and all these other countries, in essence, weren't terminated.
Yeah, they still exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when Hawaii was inducted into the state in 1959,
Well, actually,
that override?
okay, so now let's take a look. Okay, so we covered Hawaii as an independent state, right? Independent state. Okay, so now let's speak about Hawaii as a state. State of Hawaii, like the state of New York, right? So, question is, for the state of Hawaii, what formed the state of Hawaii? Anybody? Something created the state of Hawaii within the United States. (1959) Statehood Act. Statehood Act is an act of Congress. United States Congress passed that law. That's what created the state of Hawaii. Does anybody know what was the state of Hawaii before 1959? Territory of Hawaii. Territory of Hawaii was created by a congressional act, 1900, called the Organic Act. That's a congressional law. Anybody know how U.S. Congress could pass laws that apply to Hawaii? Remember, this is the Hawaiian Kingdom, and this is the United States. Two independent states in this family of nations, right? They're both independent. Only American law applies to American territory, only Hawaiian law applies to Hawaiian territory, right? That's the fundamental rule of independence. So, how could the U.S. Congress pass laws that apply to Hawaii as an independent state? Something that must have happened before 1900.
Is this the non-existing treaty of annexation? Is that what we're getting into?
Actually, there is no treaty, but there is something that said Hawaii was annexed, and that was called the Joint Resolution of Annexation, an agreement made by the House and Senate and signed into law by the President. That's another congressional action. So what we have here in 1898 is an American law. In 1900, an American law. In 1959, an American law. American laws are limited to U.S. territory. Right? The only way that the Territorial Act could have any legal effect in Hawaii, and the Statehood Act having any legal effect, is you remove joint resolution and you put treaty of annexation. Now, if Hawaii was annexed by a treaty from the Hawaiian Kingdom government joining the United States, then Hawaii would be the state of Hawaii today. The problem is, there's no treaty. There's only a joint resolution of annexation, which means Hawaii was never annexed. So the state, Hawaiian Kingdom, still exists. Because internal laws cannot affect Hawaii no more than American law can affect Canada, affect Great Britain, France. Does that make sense? Huh?
Even now, still the.
Even till now, yes. US Congress has no effect beyond its borders. Period. That's just how it works.
So what made the decision from like going from a territory to a state?
That was a move more for political reasons internally in Hawaii between the Republicans, the plantation owners, and the minorities in Hawaii, which became the Democratic Party, because especially the Japanese population is coming from Japan on a GI Bill. They're going to law school. They want to take control. You got the head of the police department, John Burns, stepping in, becomes governor, and you have a lot of things written on that. So it's really a power struggle between the Democrats and the Republicans, but internal. Yeah. And the move to become a state was to basically get more power under American law to the state itself, because the governors were always appointed in the territorial days, as opposed to being elected. Right? But again, it's all internal, limited to US territory that has nothing to do with the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. Yeah. So what you're learning here is the theoretical framework of IR, right? Without which you wouldn't be able to understand this. And that's what I'm kind of sharing with you, is those principles of international relations, not all of it, just the basic principles that can illuminate Hawaii's situation. Yeah. Does it make sense? You guys following me? Okay. Now when I got my PhD, just to give you an idea, see, I already went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and that's another story in and of itself, okay, in representing the Hawaiian government. When we're up there, okay, first of all, in the video, did I speak of Rwanda?
Yes.
Okay, now you know the reason why I went to UH, right? To not politicize this information, but to institutionalize it, right? To not racialize it, yeah? Institutionalize it, and put it or speak to it within the appropriate theoretical frameworks that already exist. And in this case, I'm gonna use IR. So when I got my master's degree, I was not well liked at the University of Hawaii, because it basically undermined all the research. It's like you guys playing baseball. This is football. Whenever you say colonization, colonization does not apply between independent states. Occupation does. See, colonization applies to territories that are not independent states. They're outside of the family of nations, like Aotearoa. They get colonized, right? But they're part of the British Empire, okay? Now, unlike Aotearoa, let's say India as a former colony, then would be decolonized and become a member of the family of nations in the 1940s. Okay. Colonization and decolonization has no place for Hawaii as an independent state, but it can fit within this narrative of Hawaii being a state of Hawaii within the United States, and Native Hawaiians look like a tribe. And then speak to federal recognition, which is all internal, but it has nothing to do with the Hawaiian Kingdom. Yeah. Does that make sense? So up at UH, I was like the Grim Reaper, you know, destroyer of paradigms, you know, because I had to make sure, let's talk straight. Let's not leave this up to freedom of speech. If we're talking occupation, and I just came from The Hague, this is for real. This is not like we're testing a theory. This theory is moving and we're in it, right? So when I got my master's, specializing in international relations in 2004, then I got my PhD, I purposely selected professors to sit on my doctoral committee who I knew could not agree with me that Hawaii is occupied. I think I'm crazy, huh? A lot of my classmates said, Keanu, what are you doing? I said, hey, if they can find a hole in my research, I need to either shore it up or I'm wrong. That's how it works. This is called analytical rigor. And I'm used to taking critique from the Army. It's called after action reviews. I'm good. A lot of local people don't like getting critiqued. Oh, brother, join the Army, you get used to it. You know, and it's good. That's how you learn. So I picked professors to sit on my committee. My chair was Neil Milner. He's always on Channel 4 News. He's the older, howdy guy. Nice man. Law and judicial behavior is his background. His doctoral dissertation was on the Miranda rights from the 1960s. Public law, Katharina Heyer, and John Wilson, theory of sovereignty. The Greek Polish state, the welfare state, Rousseau, you know, all that stuff. Baudin. And then I had the dean of the law school from UH, Avi Soifer. His master's in law, specialized in constitutional law. Then I had the dean from the University of London, Great Britain, state sovereignty and international law. Then I only had one Native Hawaiian on my committee from the Hawaiian Studies Department, Professor Kanalu Young, who tragically passed away before my dissertation defense, and John Osorio stepped in. All of them could not believe what they were reading in my chapters, because I basically just brought it out. But all I did was provide the appropriate theoretical framework, and they couldn't deny it. All they asked at the end was, Keanu, how do you fix the problem? I said, I'm glad I got you to ask how you fixed the problem, because before this, you didn't think we had a problem. So chapter 5 gets into how you begin to right the wrong. And how do you begin to right the wrong? Education, awareness, and knowledge. That's the beginning, right? And that's where we're at now. You know, continuing with that, spreading the word internationally. But I can tell you things are actually moving pretty quickly. I'm actually heading back to Bern, Switzerland in February. Remember that Universal Postal Union? Yeah. Meeting has already been set up. They see it. So once you provide the facts in front of people who know how the system works, doors open. But if you go to that international level without knowing the system, but you're walking in with this system, doors don't open, because you're talking the wrong language. Any questions? Yes?
Okay, so it's clear from our discussion with this and from the video that we watched that your role in this is you know, you do your best to stay neutral and be purely informative.
Right.
And so, that being said, this thought must have crossed your mind at some point. In the purely hypothetical situation, you've been studying the game. I mean,
Right.
you know, I remember in the video watching that you referenced like the Hawaiian Kingdom's laws and what applied.
Right.
So I know this had crossed your mind at one point. In a hypothetical situation, what legal actions would the United States have to take? Because we got to the point where we're at, okay, the authority of the government was relinquished until the time that the United States would do an investigation and restore authority back to the Hawaiian government.
Right.
So from a legal standpoint, what if the United States laws would apply in this situation in restoring authority back to the Hawaiian Kingdom?
Okay, so United States laws would not apply to Hawaii, period, because they're domestic laws. What would apply is international laws called humanitarian law. So humanitarian law is the law of occupation and the laws of war, in particular the Hague and Geneva Conventions. So Article 43 of the Hague Convention, which is a codification, right? Codification of already existing customary law from the 19th century, mandates the occupier to form a military government to administer the laws of the occupied state. That's the rule, which they haven't done since 1893, because if they did do that, then they pronounced to the whole world that Hawaii is occupied and the kingdom still exists. That doesn't work because Hawaii has 118 military bases here and is headquarters for the Pacific Command. That's why Hawaii is targeted for nuclear strike by North Korea, which prompted the false alarm. North Korea, Kim Jong-un targeted Hawaii 2013, not because of our beaches, not because of Pondos, it's because of Pacific Command. That's the reason. So we are in a position today because of the non-compliance to humanitarian law. The non-compliance by the United States, because they were concealing Hawaii to be annexed. that was what was being portrayed. It's like Hawaii, use the colloquial term, Hawaii was kidnapped but treated like it was adopted. We have no adoption peoples. So we're still kidnapped. But why do I believe I'm American? That goes now to a particular crime, international crime, called denationalization. That was in 1906. The formal policy was made, Program for Patriotic Exercises, 1906, public schools, private schools. which is my tutu's generation, my grandparents' generation. They went to school, all you learned was American history, American presidents, nothing about the Hawaiian Kingdom, nothing. And you were forced to speak English, and you can speak Hawaiian, which is the national language, not the native language. Remember, it's the country. It's like speaking Hawaiian in Hawaii is like speaking Spanish in Spain, right? You speak Hawaiian, you get beaten. Those are the stories that the kupuna say. It's all starting to make sense. Now, did you know that right there is exactly what the Germans did during World War II? Occupation of Luxembourg, occupation of some of the other states. There's actually a list in the indictment. That's a war crime. So by the time that information that was taught to my tutu got to my parents, it's already institutionalized. My dad, who was born in 1939, knew nothing. By the time it got to me at the Kamehameha schools, out of sight, out of mind, I didn't know anything. I went to a military college because I wanted to be in the military because a lot of my family members were in the military. And then I'm finding out, oh, it's still a country, it's occupied. Whoa, see, now all of a sudden that paradigm starts to shift and it gets a little scary. Because then, when that balloon goes up, you fire live rounds. I had no problem with that, I was trained. In fact, I kind of look forward to it because that's how you're trained in the Army. But when you start to think about it, you're going, wait a minute, am I in the right Army? Am I even American? You know, all the things that I took for granted, I'm now questioning, but I never questioned before, because there was no need to question. Maybe I think I better get out. What about my uncles who got drafted in Vietnam? Some of them never come back. Whoa. You know, it's a different paradigm. And that's when I decided to retire after 10 years, Army discharge, 1994, and I proceeded down this path. So I'm not an activist, I'm not against anything, I'm a realist. It is called a spade, and now we gotta deal with it. Right? So I don't try to compromise Hawaii's history any more than it has been compromised. What I try to do is understand it. And this idea of it was a racial lens that people use today, you had a lot of people in the kingdom that are not Native Hawaiian. A lot, that were part of protecting this thing, you know. One in particular, Paul Newman, he was the attorney, in fact, for Queen Liliuokalani. He was an American, he became a Hawaiian subject, he got naturalized. You know, so you're talking allegiance, it's not ethnicity. And that's what this information here that I teach comes from that standpoint. I don't base it on race, I don't base it on culture. This is poli-sci, this is law. This is how it is. And then from here, let's see how we can fix the problem. Now, I'm actively involved in fixing this problem. You know, I wear so many hats, right? If you think I'm just here talking story, well, there are things that are happening outside, because when you speak the language, you now have somebody you can converse with. And that person you can converse with, let's say in Zurich, Bern, The Hague, they know they are in a position to do something within that structure. I'm very much operating within the system. I'm not operating outside of the system. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not trying to create revolution. I'm a practical guy saying, wait a minute, how come you can say this regarding your country and I can't? Are you becoming this thing of race, or are we talking law? See, now I can use it against them. In fact, I came up with a word in my larger article called reverse power relation differential. See, in poli-sci, you can make up your own words. Right? Reverse power relation differential, it's called political jujitsu. See, I'm dealing with a monolith of power, right? So let's say Kaili is the big power guy. Can't beat him, but I can manipulate him. I can pull a jujitsu move on him, and I will use his weight, or Aikido, I'll use his weight against him, but I gotta know him, right? See, that's where the education comes in. How do I take advantage of a force to my advantage? And then there's also in international relations, it's called realist theory. See, I'm not a proponent, but I understand realist theory. Hans Morgenthau. Realist theory in international relations stemmed after the World War II. See, prior to that, it was called the utopian theory, yeah? Wilsonian. Everybody worked together, League of Nations, boom, World War II broke out. Almost, people say that's a failed theory. So then comes this emerging of a realist theory. And they're saying countries only do things if there are certain issues involved, called self-preservation. If I can get a country's interest on self-preservation, I can talk to them. If I can talk to some country with self-interest and there's a mutual self-interest, I can talk to it. If I can talk to a country for self-reliance, I can talk to it. See, I need to then look at this family of nations today, and who is it in their interest to help us? It's not an ethical question. A lot of it is based on political economy, military, those kind of issues. So that's another level of where this goes, and I cover that in my graduate course. You know, getting into those areas, deep. I mean, it's like you're going down the rabbit hole. But those are the real theories that take place, that are being applied. So, a lot of information I think that you folks are getting today. I just kind of wanted to take off from what you folks saw and give you more things to think about. The idea here is not to give you so many answers, but I hope I can get you to start asking more questions. That's the key. Not necessarily getting all the answers, but framing or forming the right questions.
Another question? I mean, I know,
Yes.
I'm sorry, so I was able to read most of their questions, and almost everyone had a question about what's next.
Kavama Hope, remember? What's next? Kavama Hope, look to the past. But what comes to the future, what now, it's not just what happened 100 years ago, 100 years ago to what just happened 1 second ago when I just said something. History is relevant. We're not disconnected. It is part of you, it is part of us. And the important thing about history, don't limit it to yourself. In this case, look at the world history. What case is similar to us? See, why don't we ask that question? Is there a similar case to Hawaii? Occupied 125 years, January 17th. Anybody know of a case that is similar? Because it only can happen within the family now. Okay, we can't talk about Aotearoa, we cannot talk about Tamatoa from Tahiti, we cannot talk about Navajo. We're talking independent states. Anybody know of something that is similar to our situation? Prolonged occupation. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. 1941, Stalin went in during World War II. Occupied it till 1991. It's now back to where it used to be. It used to be a member of the League of Nations in the 1920s. It's now a member of the United Nations. Theirs was 50 years of occupation. That was the longest, except for us. And the important thing here is we have to keep stressing Hawaii is a state in international relations, period. It's a conclusion. Because the only way you can get out of this narrative is to remove Hawaii as an independent state, replace it with a nation of Native Hawaiians. Now you're talking tribal. Now you're talking everything here. Yet these ideas are mutually exclusive. You cannot be a native tribe in the United States and an independent state in international relations. They cancel each other out. And it's part of the false narrative. So the Apology Resolution of 1993, false narrative. Says Native Hawaiians have a right to self-determination. No, they don't. That is an American system, under American federal Indian law. Native Hawaiians are nationals of an occupied state under international law who has rights under humanitarian law, Hague and Geneva Conventions. That's how it works. So once you maintain this position that Hawaii is a state, it's not a choice, it is, then everything else opens up here. But sometimes you start to walk into this new paradigm, or old paradigm, with baggage from the other paradigm. And then it becomes confusing. Then you suffer from cognitive dissonance. Now you're like, what? You gotta separate them. Baseball, football. That's the easiest way I can say it. You guys good? Was this information shocking? You guys kind of look like deers with the headlights on. And that's good because you're in higher education. And this is where these ideas are here to get you to think. That's the whole point. Critical thinking, right? Not political positions. Critical thinking, analytical rigor, footnotes, theory, terminology, definitions, that's the key. Because you will come to the same conclusion I have if you apply the appropriate theory. Now, the Permanent Court of Arbitration already verified Hawaii to be an independent state. That's why I'm saying it's out of our hands. They verified it. It is, whether you like it or not. Now from there, we move on, which led to Universal Postal Union, which leads to other issues, which leads to this. You always have to make sure you start off on the right foot. Because if you start off on the wrong foot, you're still off. You gotta change step, right? And that's the key. So don't make a position statement yet. I just hope that I've encouraged you folks to think more and see how you may be affected by this from wherever you come from, or whatever discipline you want to be involved with, whether poli-sci, anthro, history, American studies, whatever the case is. But you can still use the terms. They're supposed to be universal. This is academic first, and that's why I'm here. I'm not getting you politically active. I'm just getting you to think. Yeah? You guys good? Mahalo.